It's my great honor and privilege to humbly introduce the Honorable Justice André Chamberlain, who's a member of the Innu Nation first generation residential school and forced child removal survivor. Previous to his law career, Justice Chamberlain worked in mental health and adult psychiatric crisis intervention in Toronto, worked in the Adolescent Drug Treatment Center in Thunder Bay. Justice Chamberlain has worked as a federal Crown Counsel since 2001, has served as deputy team leader, Toronto's Old City Hall, as immigration prosecution counsel. Justice Chamberlain specializes in restorative justice and has served as lead crown prosecutor in Gladue Court and is currently the federal team lead for the Drug Treatment Court. Justice Chamberlain, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, and thank you for that warm introduction. I might have sent you the wrong one. It sounds like I'm still the federal lead for the Drug Treatment Court. That was in my previous job before my appointment, so I may have misstated that. I'm currently, though, the chair of the New Toronto Courthouse Gladue Court lead. So I am the chair of the Gladue Court for the City of Toronto at the moment. So thank you for that warm welcome. What I was hoping to do with you today was just to share a little bit about my own personal story. I think, you know, we've seen the news, we've read the stories about residential schools, about you know, the plight of Indigenous people in this country. And we see it every day. If we are in courts, we see the folks come through our system who have been touched and affected by residential schools, by the impact of colonialism and racism in this country and oppression, and how that's led to the over-incarceration of Indigenous folks, a significant overrepresentation of Indigenous folks in the criminal justice system. What I like to do is I'd like to just personalize a little bit and just tell you a little bit about my story, because I think the story of my family is in some ways representative of much of what's going on in this country. And I think it helps us to understand it when it's in a personal context, because what we see the folks who come before us who have, you know, these issues coming through the courts, but it's a much bigger and a broader picture in terms of the effect in the community and in the population. So I think that's what I'd like to share, if I can, if you'll allow me to. So I'll start back in 1985, if I might, just because that was a year that I both sobered up and came out of the closet. And so it was a year of change for me and a year of growth as I started to come to terms with who I was, both as a gay man and as an alcoholic and drug addict. And so that was the beginning of kind of moving forward and taking some steps with respect to recovery. I also had known all my life that I was adopted. I was adopted by a French-Canadian family up in northwestern Quebec. And at the time, you know, they knew very little about my birth family, only that my mother was 18 years old when I was born, and that she was not able to care for me and had decided to give me up for adoption, and really did not know much of anything else beyond that. So in the late 1980s, I decided to try and take some steps to discover my birth family. Because I was adopted in Quebec, the process was a little bit easier in that if the child is seeking to make a connection, they will contact the birth mother and see whether she's interested in making a connection. But in my case, my mother had already registered previously, so it became very quick. So in 1989, around, or maybe 1990, around October, I sent a letter asking for all non-identifying information and asking for the opportunity to make connections with my birth family. I got a letter back in 2 weeks saying, here's all your non-identifying information. And with respect to your request to meet your birth family, we will contact you shortly. And then at the bottom of that letter was a signature, and then was a PS following the signature that said, you may want to consider applying for a status card through Indian Affairs since your mother was Indigenous. And that was the first indication that I had, or the first real indication I had that I was Indigenous. I did have some clues before. I had a good friend when I was living and working in Thunder Bay in mental health there. I had a good friend who was Indigenous, who had been adopted as well, but adopted by an Indigenous family. And we used to chat all the time, and she would often say, "I think you've got some Indian blood in you," at the times, and so my thought was that, listen, those voyageurs in Quebec were in and out of those teepees, so I suspect that there's a lot of Quebecers have some Indigenous blood on some level. But I didn't put too much weight in that. But that was the first indication in that letter from my birth family that, in fact, both my parents, it turned out, were Indigenous at the time. And the way that they worked it through social services was really interesting, because they would interview both individuals. So they didn't just get the information and put you in touch together. What they would do is they interviewed me and essentially got my life story and recorded all that, made notes of all that, and then talked to my mother and got her life story. And then they would trade that through the social worker, just so that the first meeting didn't become this overwhelming need for information. And I thought it was a really smart way of doing it. So I learned from the social worker that my mother was indeed Indigenous, that she had spent 10 years in residential schools up in Fort George, Quebec, and that she had returned, had been raped by a neighbor, and as a result had become pregnant with me, and then had then from there had been forced to give me up for adoption. That she'd married not long after she got back to a man who had his own issues with alcoholism and was a victim of violence and domestic violence, and had that I had 5 brothers and sisters. I had and that they had a fairly troubled life given the background and supports that they had. And then she heard my story, and then we were in contact, and I first met my mother essentially that January, just 3 months after I'd made my first attempt at making contact with her. I'm going to share just a little bit of my screen just to give you a better perspective, just to give you a bit more information. If you'll allow me, just give me 1 second to. I hope you can all see that. Let me know if you can't. So as I mentioned, I found out that my family was from Meshtoyach, which is a small community just on the western side of Lac Saint-Jean, which is kind of southern central Quebec. And it's just kind of there. And that my mother was from that area. And that when she was about 6 years old, she was sent to residential school. Now, just to give you a better perspective, this is a map of a combination of Ontario and Quebec here. And at the bottom here on the left in the square, that's where Toronto is. And to the right here in the center bottom is the area where Montreal is. And up here where the arrow is, that's Meshtoyach. That's the community that my family is from in, in central Quebec. And at the top here, you'll see kind of at the top of the James Bay, where it's kind of getting near Hudson's Bay, is Fort George. And that is the location where my mother was sent to residential school at the age of 6. It was a long, arduous trip. She, I think, from what I read, was not sent home for the first 2 years that she was there. She stayed there for the first 2 years before she was allowed to go back home and have summer vacations with her family. She spent some 10 years there, and it was a difficult time. It wasn't easy. She had, they weren't allowed to speak the language. There was often a lot of violence. She didn't go through the kinds of, brutal sexual violence that we've heard in terms of some of the other communities and some of the other residential schools. And I'm not saying it didn't happen at that school, but she didn't recount any particular such instances for herself. But that's a picture of her there, a class picture at the residential school. Taken, I think, not long after she got there, probably a couple of years after she got there. And that's her there in the forefront. So it was a tough time. She was isolated from her community. She became essentially strangers to her family and to her parents, and spent her time there. Now, she was lucky because she had some sisters. She had a couple of sisters who were close in age to her. And she and some of their friends would sneak off and they would maintain their language. They would speak to each other sometimes in Innu. And so she retained her language throughout her life. And when she got back, but when she got back to her community, she was essentially a stranger to them. And so when she was coming home about a year after, not long after she got back, she was cutting through a field and one of the neighbors who was drunk accosted her and raped her. And as I mentioned, she became pregnant. Now, at the time, I thought, well, as might not be, you might not be surprised. Who she turned to was the priest on the reserve. She went to him to explain what had happened, and he was actually fairly progressive, I would say, for his time. He helped her draft a letter of complaint about this incident. But because she was 17 years old at the time that she was raped, she couldn't on her own make the complaint. Her father had to sign in order for it to be actioned. So he refused to do so. I think her sense was that he felt it would bring shame on the family, and so he did not want to do that. And so essentially the fact that she was raped was swept under the rug, and it just wasn't discussed and wasn't talked about. Soon after, they found out she was pregnant, and because, again, she was, they didn't know how to manage it. I don't know where the decision came, but she was essentially sent away to Quebec City to have me. She was in a girls' home for a while, and I was born in the orphanage. So that's what I learned about my mother's history and then when I met her, there's a couple stories that I like to share. That one was that on the first weekend that I went there to meet her, we'd spoken a number of times on the phone by this time, but a couple months later I was up visiting, and I was over at her place, and she said, "I want to show you something." And she came out of her room with a newspaper. And she said, around the time that you would have been 12 years old, there was a soccer tournament in our town where indigenous kids from all over the province had come to play in this soccer tournament. And on the front of the newspaper was a photograph showing some of the kids playing. And the kid who was at the forefront of that photograph looked a lot like her next older son, my brother, Jean-Claude. And she showed me this picture. And she said, I always wondered if this was you. And so I wanted to show you and ask, was this you? I knew it wasn't going to be me because I've never played soccer in my life. But it also it brought home to me the pain that she had, right? That she spent her life looking for me. Sorry. That she never lost hope that she would find me. And she spent had a lot of emotional pain and a lot of emotional difficulty, leading to her own addictions and her own depression and her own mental health issues. I think a lot of it related to her experience in residential school, and a lot of it related to the loss of her first child, that was significant for her in her life. So, that really brought it home to me, the impact of what happens to folks through the residential school program. The other story is that the night before I left, we were staying at my sister's house. She had a bigger house, so we were all staying there. And the night before, I was supposed to leave in the morning, and my mother said, I think I'm going to go home tonight. I think it's going to be too hard to say goodbye in the morning, so I'm going to say goodbye now and go home. So I said, okay, I understand. So we said goodbye, and it was lovely. And then the next morning she called and said, listen, come on over. I want to see you before you go. So we popped over there on my way out. And, when I got there, she said, I got home last night, she said, and I cried for 4 hours. And I couldn't stop crying. She said, because all I could imagine, all I could remember was me with my face up against the nursery window, looking at you in that bassinet, knowing I was never going to see you again. And again, I was struck by the kind of pain and torture that she went through, all because she wasn't given a voice. When we looked at the papers, I brought my papers with me. And when we looked at the papers, the adoption papers, she looked at that signature on that document and she said, that's my writing, but that's not my writing. She said, I'm sure that I signed that when I was drugged, because although she recognized it as her hand, she said, there's no way that's my signature, and there's no way that I consented to that. in any way, with a clear mind. And she said there was never any discussion about that, right? So, that's the kind of pain that she kind of lived with. Now, having said that, she had, a very warm and loving family. She was very much the central figure in the family. Sorry. Sorry. This picture was taken in 2012. I'm down there in the bottom right-hand corner. She's up in the top right-hand corner in the light green shirt there. And that's not even our whole family. That is, there are in that group about 4 in-laws. So we can discount some of them. But I know one of my brothers is not there. And there are a number of the grandchildren who are not there. And given that it was 2012, that was also, I can tell you that since then there are many more grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in fact. So there are a number of generations. So just, when we talk about the impact of residential schools and we talk about the impact of colonialism and oppression and all that's been inflicted on Indigenous communities, we talk about my mother as a survivor of residential school, and her husband, I think, was a survivor of residential school as well, as was, I think, my birth father. So there's 3 people that were impacted by all of this. And what you have here is a representation of that intergenerational trauma, right? A representation of how her pain and her suffering, her depression and the struggles she had in life, in some ways were passed down to many of my family members, right? And of course, we see the worst of it in the courts, right? We see the worst of the trauma. We see the worst of the suffering, the folks who are deeply addicted and who are traumatized to the extent that they have a very low ability to function at times and find themselves involved in the criminal justice system. But, we represent a much larger slice than just what we see in the criminal justice system, right? I'm a judge. I have colleagues who are judges that I know and are friends with who are Indigenous, who have also parents who've gone through the residential school system. I have a friend who disclosed to me that as they were finding out about the kids at the Kamloops Residential School, the 215 unmarked graves or mass graves that they discovered there, heard from her mother that in fact they had a 5-year-old brother, uncle to my friend, who died in residential school and that they never talked about. She found out she had an uncle that the family never talked about because the pain was so great, and it was only this summer that she learned about that, right? So it's not just the folks that you see coming before you, I think, is one thing I want to point out. It could be your coworkers, it could be your colleagues, it could be the other stakeholders that we are everywhere. We are a larger part of the community and a growing part of the community. As you can see, we grow and we are expanding as a community, but we're still dealing with that intergenerational impact, right? So that's kind of the part that I wanted to talk about, just a little bit about personalizing, the impact of Indigenous folks in the Indigenous community and how colonialism and oppression have played a significant factor in who we are today. And I'm proud. People, I think, have cautioned me, or I think I always get a little concerned because of how personal my story is and how much I share in that story. But I'm proud of it, because it's a legacy of pain, and it is a legacy of trauma and difficulty, but it's also a legacy of resilience, right? My family, we have our struggles. Not everybody's thriving, the way that I appear to be. I have a brother who's doing life on the installment plan, but I have a sister who's just recently retired, having worked at the band office for years, and a brother who, has done various jobs and now works in a group home for adults with developmental difficulties. And I have, some are in recovery, some are still struggling with their addiction. And, we see that life goes on and life carries on, right? But we keep working to make it better and to heal, but it takes time. The teachings tell us it can take up to 7 generations of healing in order for to get past these kinds of trauma. So it's a long journey, but we need the help and the supports where we can get it. And I think I would implore you as drug treatment court professionals to learn about the Indigenous community, to learn to work with the Indigenous community, and to learn to adapt your programs and your processes to see how you can better serve the Indigenous community and its particular needs moving forward. So anyway, I do have to wrap it up because I do have a judgment to give it a couple of minutes, but I do want to take the opportunity to thank everybody for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored that you've allowed me to share my story and my mother's story and the story of my family and my community. And I'm grateful that I'm able to do that as part of the work that I do here in the courts, both in the Gladue court and the work that I've done previously in the drug treatment court as the lead crown at the time for many years at Old City Hall in Toronto. And for and grateful to Kofi because he was really the one who brought me into the court. He saw the experience that I had and was very, I think instrumental in getting me onto that track of a restorative justice court. So I'm very grateful to him as well. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much, Justice Chamberlain. Thank you for your voice, for your story, and the work that you do to make lives better. We really appreciate your keynote this morning, and thank you for your time.
I'll be back this afternoon, I think, for another one of the other panels. So, but I'll be a lot less chatty then.
Looking forward to seeing you then. Thank you, Your Honor.